Okay, folks, so I'm here now with Elise DeVilliers. She's one of the excellent teachers at the Next Generation of Vedic Astrology conference. She's going to be teaching on divine timing and transits, an excellent subject that everybody needs to understand. And we're going to have her today walk us through what this class is going to be about. First, Elise, I wanted to thank you for your participation in this and ask you, what made you come to this subject? I know it's something that you've been seeing in your readings and you felt it's really important. Why don't you enlighten us?
Yeah, thanks, Sam, first of all, for inviting me to the conference. Yeah, interesting with my own personal experience with transits in my own life, but also with readings and with clients. I've noticed over the little while that, when we really pay attention to what's happening in the sky of today, the living sky, there are these events happening based on where the planets are transiting. Of course, they all affect us. It affects us as a collective because it's in a certain sign and we're all experiencing that planet in the sign. But then there's the personal side of it when we start to see the birth chart and where that transit lands in which house. And I started to really notice in my readings that people would come to life when I would talk about particularly transits of the bigger, the outer planets, that Saturn movement every 2.5 years, or Jupiter's movement every year, and the nodal axis. The nodal axis really seems to capture people's attention because they can resonate that there was something that changed. Yes, this year I've heard a lot of, end of September, everything changed when the nodal axis shift. So I find that, of course, the dasha is important. Of course, reading the natal chart is important, but I always save time for the transits. And I find it's the perfect way to really bring people into the now, because it's relative to something that's happening right here in their life. It's like the planet landed on their lap, but they didn't know what they were working with. They didn't understand the energies. And then that's where my knowledge of the planet and the sign it's in and which house it's in for them really comes to play.
And that's perfect. The way you said that is so perfect. It really brings them into the now.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so true because again, all the it's this balancing act between the dashas, which is like the karmas unfolding from the soul level, like the soul is learning these lessons, but then wherever those again slower moving planets are, they're bringing us into some lesson and bringing some sort of pressure with Saturn, or some kind of expansion with Jupiter, some kind of confusion maybe, or thing with the nodal axis within the context of the dashas.
That's right. And especially this year with the movement of Saturn into Capricorn, into its own sign. Of course, collectively, we experienced it as complete structural changes, rule changes, isolation, all the stress and pressure and whatnot of Saturn being in Capricorn.
He brought the hammer down in 2020.
Oh my gosh, so harsh. But then as I talk to each person and we realize, okay, so, for this Taurus, it's transiting their house of faith, that ninth house. And all of a sudden they're questioning their beliefs and things are starting to crumble. And yet these new beliefs are starting to spring up. And so there's just that, there's a connection because they actually see this thing happening live in the present moment. So,
and those things, like you just said, just real quick, those things you're saying about maybe the question of faith from the Taurus is also happening within the context of the dashas.
Completely, of course. And one thing that I really find interesting too, because of course the dasha is showing us what the soul is learning very personally, right? It's a very personal lesson for that person. But then there's the nuance to where is that dasha lord in the living sky right now, and where is it moving? And then again, you can't escape those movements of the slower moving planets. Like that Saturn transit's always going to come and touch us in a very profound way. Or again, the Jupiter or nodal axis movement, very profound shift in consciousness or shift in life events. So I've just found this to be one of the most important things to help people wake up to that these transits, the sky is not just, how we learn in science, a bunch of rocks, circulating because of gravity, that there is so much more consciousness that we're dealing with here. There are things beyond our little world, our little world of making money, being with the family, going to work. There's just so much more at play. And then that helps us really tap into the lessons of our karmas as well, because then we're not negating parts of life. We're actually realizing, oh, it all matters.
Yeah, and I love these these points that you have, the dasha cycles as our personal experience. Then you say transits occur in the living sky, creating events here on Earth, of course, within the dasha cycles as well. Transits as a collective experience and examples. This is one of the biggest things where we see the transits. This is why even like a lot of my updates and whatnot, I talk like again we just said it now that Saturn went into Capricorn and all those other planets, and we see the collective experience around that with something like COVID or whatever it might be. The nodes moved into September, in the end of September. The nodes moved from Gemini to Taurus. Collectively, we see a shift with those transits, and then we feel it more personally through our dashas and whatnot, or as those planets hit planets in our natal chart, and then bringing it all together: birth chart, dasha, transit. This is going to be a great, examination.
Yeah, I actually love bringing it all together because I find initially clients are so focused on their birth chart, as we all are when we get into astrology. We think the birth chart's everything. So
right.
Excited. My moon is here. My sun is here. And
me.
I know. And certainly that's how I learned. I wouldn't have learned astrology without really studying and diving into the birth chart, because that is my nature. And same thing with anyone I speak to about their chart. I want to understand their nature. But at the same time, where are they in that evolution of their nature according to the dashas, right? Because the dashas really let us know what's evolving right now. If you've been in Jupiter for 18 years and then you suddenly shift into Saturn, it's jaw-dropping difference. They're not comparable. And so when I can talk to somebody about that, this is what this was like, and now you've shifted into this more responsibility. Perhaps, you're feeling a bit more restricted and things are becoming real. Anything that you thought the universe was going to take care of before, now you've got to get serious and organized. This rings true. At the same time, look at the restructure in your life and all of the pressure that Saturn's brought this year. And then at the same time, looking at even just the gentle transits. Like I love looking at where the moon moves. And, anyone who's just watching the new moons and the full moons alone, just to bring so much richness to your everyday life, because you know what you're feeling according to those transitions, but you also know what everyone else around you is going through. And I find this is the biggest thing, is like realizing under this living sky, we're all experiencing it together. And it's not so me. It's not just my birth chart. It's how all these birth charts are interacting with each other and with this sky of today. And I think you said this to me many times in many classes, is that it's actually this living astrology that we're in today that's the most important. Because if we're stuck in the past of just our birth chart, we're missing out on all of the richness that's right here in the present moment.
Yeah, and again, you're opening up so many things here. All of it, absolutely, and also seeing the different cycles. Because again, what we're talking about is the dashas are the karmic cycles of the soul,
That's
and
right.
again, the soul nature that you've incarnated to to uncover isn't necessarily connected with transit, so to speak. It's kind of a transcendent. You're going through that, and the transits are in many ways the conditioning factors, the daily pressures, the world that you're grappling with, in particular the world in relation to other people, and how. So we're all seeing within that large context of these different cycles, and what tends to happen is as you've already indicated to some extent, is that we get confused by this, and astrologers can confuse us. Well, what if the dasha says one thing and the transit says another thing? Which one is right? Which is more important? They're not
Totally.
they're not the same thing. It's like saying, well, what if I eat, what if I put salt and I put sugar? Which one's more important? Well, they're both there. It's not a contest. And so seeing
Absolutely.
that larger context is really what is valuable here.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because when I think about the dasha or my karma unfolding, if I think about, whatever I'm doing for my mindfulness practice, and I've got a concept, oh yes, right now I'm working on relationships and how to relate better to people, and this is my karma. And then I go out into the world and all kinds of other things just start to fly. We have an agenda for the day and we might have a to-do list, and these are all the things I want to accomplish. But then we get into the world and we start to realize the to-do list gets pushed aside because there's all this other stuff, this traffic that comes our way. And that's really like the transits. No matter what we're working on a soul level, we also have to deal with each other and all the other events that are happening. And that's like the transits and the dashas connecting with each other. So you don't get to choose one over the other. They're both commingling. And just like we find life to be very stressful when there's too much going on, this can be like studying astrology. There's a lot going on. So all of it needs to be recognized, synthesized, discussed. And then from there, I think what's really important is in our life, trying to find some stillness so that it all makes sense, because we can really get caught up in noise,
Yeah.
especially if we get caught up in collective noise, right? So there is this collective, and sometimes, if we just live with the radio and the TV on and just watch the news, it gets very cluttered up here, So this is also the part I say about divine timing, is because all of this is divine, and then it's us navigating it due to the unfolding of the karmas, and really getting to the core of the lessons with consciousness rather than sleeping through it. That's the
Exactly.
thing.
Yeah.
We can sleep through it if we want.
And so again, that's always the goal, is to see the right context, because like you said, what happens is all of it is taking place. Our soul has been immersed in this karma, and when you're reading the dashas, you're reading what is the soul learning at this given time, and then you examine what are the conditions that are supporting or detracting from it. But ultimately, it's all support. All of it is supportive, if you know what the energy is. If not, then you're going to feel like this is punishing you now, or that's doing that. All of it is supportive. It's just some of the lessons are a little harder to learn. I wanted to go back and say one thing too, like you gave an example between Jupiter and Saturn, and said, oh, the Jupiter dasha, those 16 years could have been like, oh, everything unfolds easily, and then Saturn comes and it's all these hard lessons. For some people, like if you're Taurus or Libra, that Jupiter was like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing, and Saturn is like, okay, now I know what I'm doing. So it's also just based on the nature of the planet to the person as well. So all of these things need to be accounted for, so to speak, when we once we start to separate dashas and transits, and then we're looking at all of that stuff. But it's all that subtle, elegant, rhythm of life anyway. So the thing that astrology can do is shed light and bring nuance into it, like you're talking about here, rather than turning it into some false choice, which is when astrology is not taught very well. It's like, oh, it's so confusing. How do you know? And then you get overwhelmed. It's not that hard. It just needs to be shown. It's not that hard to understand it, but it needs to be taught correctly, like what you're doing here.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that really helped me with this was how you've taught about the evolution, planetary evolution, and how we evolve, because there is an array of expression for everything, whether it be a dasha or a transit or whatnot. And bringing that awareness, when we stop resisting the energy that is in our karmic unfolding, or resisting the energy of a transit, we're actually able to evolve. And how we, I guess, share our emotional intelligence is really based on the scale of our evolution of consciousness. And it's by no means easy work. It's not, but it's also not hard work when you tap into, okay, there's this huge support network behind me.
It's hard when we're ignorant of what's happening.
That's the hard part.
That's the only part that's hard, because once there's awareness, it's not hard. We're still going through it, but now we understand it. This is why I've always said so many times, even with the students, as you learn to do readings, the best thing that you really give the client is an understanding, of what they're going through. Even though they might think they want you to make predictions, they really want you to give them an understanding, so that they don't need predictions in order to feel safe. Nobody wants to feel like their whole life is depending on a damn prediction from an astrologer. That's a terrible place to be in.
Well, and interesting too, I've had clients that say things like, well, if you predict, then I don't know if I took the prediction and made it happen through my mind. And it turns into this whole thing about who made it happen. And I just find it's better to create understanding exactly the way you've trained us to do, because that's all we really need. I mean, you don't need somebody to drive your car for you. You just need someone to give you the directions. And that's
Great.
the birth map is the birth chart. You know, here's the direction.
Hello, you get it. You don't need someone. There you go. That's the way. I love it. I'm going to remember that.
There you go. There you go.
And it's the same thing. And by the way, the other thing is, it doesn't mean that you don't do predictions, but your explanation for what's going on is also a prediction, because you're inside their mind predicting and explaining those higher evolving consciousness forces that they're already living, but that they're not, but isn't so present, because they're already living the thing you're explaining. It's just getting buried beneath the confusion. They just need to be reminded in many ways.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can really see it with Saturn right now, because so many people that I'm speaking to are buried in their fear and worry, and it's so media produced. And I try to show them that whole evolution of how do you want to express this energy, because there's also this incredible teaching of Saturn where you can use this time right now for inner work. You can be still, you can be silent, you can clear your mind and actually find out what you're meant to be doing right now, rather than just feeding into the fear and frenzy. Yes, there are new structures and rules and we all live by them, but that shouldn't control your mind. Like, that's just part of everyday life now. Wear a mask and stand 6 feet apart. It's not a big deal. But then what is all the richness of Saturn and Capricorn that you're missing out on because you're stuck in the fear? That's the kind of stuff that I really like to help people with the transits, because I can't predict that you're going to do anything but live in fear if that's all you're doing is living in fear, right? If you want to do something richer, then we got to get you into a better expression, basically.
And not only, and it's not only can we do that, but we must. It's like these energies are. It's not that it's giving us the power, but it's also a deep clarion call to the soul, just like Yogananda said in Autobiography of a Yogi, that we incarnate. The chart is like that portrait of our divine challenge. Like we must do it, and we are doing it. This is the other thing to always remind people of, is that we are doing it. Even though it's difficult and painful, we're all doing it.
Yeah.
We don't have a choice. It's really happening. And it's just a matter of if we understand what it is, and if we're up for the challenge. And people are. They just also need to be shown what and like have it explained how that planet works. Like Saturn really works through solitude and stillness and being real and being practical and not being triggered by fear, instead of doing that, then facing it and being practical and down to earth and present.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely.
Well, Elise, this is going to be a great class. I'm so glad that you took some time to talk with us today about this, and we look forward to your presentation. And thank you again.
Thanks so much, Sam. Look forward to meeting you.